Thanks for coming in and spending an hour with us today on our monthly webinar series. We're going to be talking about managing GIS for Next Gen 911. So this will be a very GIS focused and driven session for us today. And in fact, we'll be really focusing on what are the things that GIS people who haven't been working in 911 need to know as they make the transition from next generation 911, particularly as they make the GIS data transition. And we'll get into what that means and what the details are about that we want to make sure everybody knows about here in just a second. But first, I'm Jeff Ledbetter. I'm a public safety GIS expert here at the Datamark team. I've been working on GIS data in 911 public safety operational settings since 2009 and had a dozen years in GIS prior to that. So I've found my passion when I found public safety, and I've been able to enjoy working with public safety professionals and GIS professionals, supporting them alike for the last 4 years with the Datamark team, and helping GIS managers make that transition in their data and learn the things that they need to learn about 911 since that time. So we're excited to get into this topic today, and again, appreciate everybody's attendance with us. So what does GIS data transition for Next Gen 911 really look like? What am I talking about? And we are going to dive into some details here today. I happen to co-chair a NENA working group under the Data Management Committee called the GIS Data Transition Working Group. We're creating in that working group and moving towards the final stages of a document that's ready for review to address this exact topic. And as we have done in that working group, I want to make sure that we clearly define what GIS data transition looks like, what it is for Next Generation 911. Just a little bit of thought about the fact that in the United States, 911 authorities, GIS data providers, and other authoritative sources of 911 data are at various phases of transition. This transition is really about GIS data that will need to meet current requirements, E911 requirements, and Next Generation 911 requirements. So we're going to use terms like legacy to refer to E911 elements and next gen to refer to Next Generation 911 elements. It'll need to that GIS data will need to appropriately route 911 calls, whether it's connected through the traditional legacy databases like ALI and MSAG, or the Next Generation 911 components like the emergency call routing function and the location validation function. Now, this webinar is not going to focus on what is ALI, what is MSAG necessarily. It's not going to focus on what is ECRF, what is LVF necessarily, but I want to make sure that everybody has kind of a basis of understanding of what we're talking about. The ALI is the Automatic Location Information database that is really about subscribers at the telephone companies, landline, VoIP, and some other services have their customer information found in the ALI database. All addresses, all location information in that ALI must be MSAG compliant, or Master Street Address Guide, MSAG compliant. The MSAG is roughly equivalent, not on a one-to-one basis, but roughly equivalent to road center lines in a GIS data set. It shows the road name, the address range, and the ESN, or emergency service number, that routes the 911 call to the right PSAP or ECC. The ECRF and LVF are elements inside the Next Generation 911 EZINet that actually answer the question, where do I send this call? And they route the piece to the proper PSAP as well. So I'm not going to go any deeper than that. I just want to make sure everybody who doesn't know what those things are gets a basic definition of what what we're kind of hinting around at here with those elements. So let's jump right into what we mean by, even more so, what we mean by transition. Oops, there we go, went too far. In this transition from E9-1 to next generation 9-1, there's a few things that you really have to think about, and we're going to go into details on these things here. Schema population needs to occur, GIS data sets of legacy 911 database, that ALI and IMSAG, of information from those legacy databases, so that the elements, some software elements in the EZNet, and again, we'll get into details on those software elements, how it uses the data, so that those software elements can sort of flip back and forth between legacy elements and next generation 911 elements. That's critical because not everybody, not every PSAP, even in states that are moving towards EZNets, that are going to begin doing geospatial call routing and things like that, even in places where they've found, they've implemented next gen 911, there's still going to be PSAPs that are on legacy telephone networks and other legacy technology that either are in the process of transitioning or just beginning to look at what it takes to make that move, that are going to be required to use what are called legacy functional elements in the next generation 911 system. So even in those places, there will be software that exchanges or translates really the legacy format into the next gen format and the next gen format into the legacy format. Also, GIS managers need to understand that GIS data built for other purposes around road center lines and address points has to get retrofitted to meet next generation 911 needs. You may have some address points, you may not have some address points, but you probably didn't build them from scratch for next generation 911 purposes. It's more likely that you built those road center lines for pavement management, or those road center lines just to make a sort of thematic map of your roads in your jurisdiction, in your city, in your counties. It's even possible that you don't have address ranges, or you don't have other important things like zone elements, like postal codes or other things like that, that a geocoder would need, because maybe you didn't build it for geocoding purposes. If that's the case for you, don't worry, you're not the only one that's in that situation. And when the 911 professionals come to you and say, hey, I need your GIS data, stand your ground and explain the situation and say, look, this data was designed and built for a purpose other than what you're asking it to do. And because of that, we're going to have to do some work to it to retrofit the needs of next generation 911. We're going to have to do some work to it to retrofit the levels of data quality to the needs of next gen 911. We're going to have to do some work to build some new data sets that we never had before, things like emergency service boundaries and PSAP boundaries, so that you have what you need for next generation 911. If that communication doesn't occur, they don't understand that they don't have what they need. They don't understand what you need to help them get what they need. And then the whole proposition falls apart. If you just hand them what you have that was really built and designed for something other than next generation 911, it's going to cause problems in their system, and it's going to come back on you, the GIS manager. So because of that, you're going to want to look at the requirements of next generation 911. You're going to need to design sustainable GIS maintenance systems and workflows for future maintenance as well. So you're not only thinking about what is the level of effort and the steps I need to take to retrofit this GIS data that was built for other purposes to meet next generation 911 needs, but also how am I going to manage and maintain that data moving forward to continue to meet next generation 911 needs and not break all the other systems that use this GIS data as well. Now, there's a lot to think about in that regard, and so you'll have to think with a very sustainable, future-oriented mindset to do this. And then one of the sort of hallmarks of this transition phase is that there will be a period of time where you as the GIS manager are maintaining GIS data, and either you or someone else is continuing to manage and maintain data in legacy databases. And so there has to be coordination between the two parties, or more than two parties, that are maintaining in this dual maintenance phase. You have to be sure that your data sets don't get far out of sync, if out of sync at all, and make sure that the edits that are occurring in one are being reflected in the other, so that when it comes time for the software elements in EZNets and other places to translate those two location information data sets, that they do it well, right? And they don't have conflicts, and that causes trouble for the delivery of 911 calls. So what are some GIS data considerations during these transition time period? Let's dive into some details on each one of these in particular. And we'll start with legacy field population. I messed up my slide, sorry about that. Hold on just a second. This is an important one, so I don't want to miss it. All right, let me share my screen again. Here you are. Okay, legacy field population. Sorry about that glitch there. In the NINA GIS data model, the purpose of legacy fields is to connect these legacy data sets with GIS data. Now, it's important to note about these legacy fields, and we'll define what they are here in just a second, is that they don't have a home and a use in an in-state NG9-1 implementation. They don't need to be in place for the time when all of the PSAPs have come into the NG9-1 EZNet, and geospatial call routing is occurring for those, and there are no PSAPs connected to those legacy functional elements. Now, the thing to note for the GIS data professional is you're not going to know when that happens except when the 911 authority comes and tells you that. And you don't need to actually make that much concern or worry about when that happens, because there's going to be a lot of things. It's going to take some time, I think, is the message I'm trying to share with you here. It's going to take some time. So plan to be in the future to be in that transition phase of dual maintenance for a while, if you're maintaining for your particular city, county, region GIS data. And that's the only point, is that these legacy fields connect those data sets. Now, the NINA standard for the NG9-1 GIS data model defines these elements and what functional elements inside the EZNet are going to use them. When it says the Master Street Address Guide, or MSAG, conversion service will make use of the information contained in GIS data, in particular, legacy attributes. So you're going to hear me refer to these, and if you hang out in these NG9-1 circles, you're going to hear people talk about legacy attributes. What are these legacy attributes? In road center lines, as well as address points, and maybe even a couple more than that in the strongly recommended data sets as well, these fields, the legacy street name pre-directional, the legacy street name type, post-directional, ESN left and right on road center lines, and ESN on the address point, the MSAG communities, left and right on road center lines, MSAG community name on the address points, postal community name, and postal code. These are all fields that are contained in legacy data set, 911 databases. MSAG has them, ALI has them. They're connected. Remember, no data comes into ALI without being valid in the MSAG. And so that's the relationship between those two. And so those data in these fields in your GIS data need to reflect what is contained in those legacy databases. Let's see, I got a chat. Maybe there's a question. Nope, good afternoon. Great. Thank you for joining us. So back to these legacies. There's a lot of discussion, particularly about these street names. There's not a lot of debate about what the ESN for a given place is. How do I populate the ESN? Well, you find out who responds to that zone, and you populate the ESN that coordinates with that. There is some discussion to be had about how you populate legacy street name elements, these 4 elements, the pre-directional, name, type, post-directional. The fact is that MSAGs all over the country are managed by different companies in their systems, different ways for different functional element needs in the legacy systems. So the thing that's most important for you as the GIS professional to know is that you should not deviate in the population of these 4 attributes. You should not deviate from what your MSAG has. This is not an opportunity for you to correct what MSAG has. Then, if you've been doing this at all, or you've looked at these 2 data sets, you'll see that MSAG may call certain streets certain things, and they may parse things differently or have different values than you would expect there to be, certainly different values than you're going to have and see in the NG911 name field, road name fields. Particularly because the parsing is especially different. But it's important for you to note as the GIS professional that you have to respect what's in that MSAG in these legacy fields. And the reason is, going back to that MCS, that MSAG conversion service, what happens there is that if there is a legacy PSAP, it's going to come through what's called a legacy PSAP gateway to find out the location information for a particular caller or location. It's going to come in a legacy format, and it's going to go to this MCS, and it's going to say, can I get this back in a PITF format? And I'm not going to worry you too much about what a PITF is at this point, but it's going to say, I need this back in the Pitiflow format. Or if it's transferring from a legacy to an NG911 PSAP, it's going to say, the NG911 PSAP is going to say, I need this in a Pitiflow format. Or if it's going the other direction, they're transferring a 911 call from an NG911 PSAP to a legacy PSAP, it's going to say, hey, I need to send this information in a legacy format. And these fields right here, these legacy fields, are what help with that translation. If we try to correct, or what we think of as correcting, we want those road name elements to be the way we want them to be instead of what's in the MSAG in these fields, will screw with that translation in a way that you don't want to be responsible for. So it's important to note that the population of these legacy fields connects those legacy 911 databases with your next generation 911 formatting in your GIS data. Now I have a question in the Q&A that I want to kind of take up here. It says, how do legacy and NG911 fields handle road extensions? For the example, Robert Road extension. Now in the next generation 911 formats, there's actually a field that is created for that called a post modifier. That's where you would put the extension element of that. In the MSAG though, it's a free-for-all. They could put it in any place. They could put it as a part of the street type. They could put it as part of the street name. I wouldn't put it past any MSAG owner to have tried to put it in a post-directional either. Crazy things happen. So this actually is a great question to the point I'm trying to make, is whatever happens in the MSAG with that extension note, whether it exists there or doesn't exist there, whether they put it in the post-directional, the type, or the name, you have to mirror or mimic exactly what they put in the MSAG in these legacy fields. But in the next generation 911 fields in your GIS data, you would put that in the post modifier field. Hope that helps answer your question there, Haley. I appreciate you asking the question. If anybody comes up with more questions, definitely just put it in the Q&A, put it in the chat if you'd like to discuss it. And I am monitoring that as we move forward. Hopefully this makes sense. This legacy field population topic makes sense. And if it doesn't, definitely throw a question in the Q&A or reach out to me after the webinar here. Another element that is closely related, and we've kind of already talked about it a little bit, right, is parsing road name elements. The NG9-1-1 GIS data model has the flexibility through these legacy fields to parse it both ways. There's a set of road name parsed according to the CLDXF, or the Civic Location Data Exchange format, as the NG9-1 elements. And then there is this legacy section that we've just been talking about to support the legacy way of doing things as well. You may need to create a custom solution, though, not only to support transition, but also in other enterprise systems in terms of parsing road name elements. Because if you have an enterprise GIS and you're sharing these road center lines to a pavement management system, an asset management system, a linear-based referencing system, or anything else like that, it's not likely that your vendor on the other side of the 911 line will respect these NG911 parsings. And so it may, it leads right into this idea of automation of concatenation or automation of outputs, the schema and deliverable variation. You're going to want to figure out if you're in that situation as the consummate GIS professional that you are, how do I maintain one schema, one data set, and have a set of automated ETLs, or extract, transform, and load scripts and automation to put out many varied outputs. This relates back to the parsing of the road names, because it's always easier to automate the concatenation rather than to automate the parsing. Sometimes parsing things back down into those very granular elements gets tricky. And so you really wouldn't want to have a fully automated process that did that. Maybe you would want to have a semi-automated process with some human checking in there. But if you were to maintain or have a maintenance schema that was that very granular parsed out road name, you could always, in your ETLs, move up in levels of granularity. In other words, if you have Avenida de los Arenas, it gets parsed into 4 fields. Avenida as a pre-type, de los as a pre-type separator, I said 4, I meant 3, and then Arenas is the street name, where you may have a pavement management system that expects all of that in 1 field. And so it's going to be much easier to maintain it in the granular, broken out and parsed format, and then in your ETL concatenate those 3 fields into 1 whenever you're exporting for your pavement management system, rather than maintaining it in the concatenated format and trying to automate parsing on an ongoing or every time you export it basis. So there's some things to think about as the GIS professional about how you want to approach moving up and down that slide of that spectrum or continuum of granularity for your road name parsing. And this doesn't only apply this idea of schema or deliverable variation, doesn't only apply to road center lines, right? Or address points. You may want to use your PSAT boundary for some other system as well. You may want to export your road center lines along with specific attributes that have nothing to do with 911 into that pavement management system, but maintain them in one geodatabase and just have exports out to those. That's what you can do with and automate them with those extract, transport, I always mess up the T, extract, transform, and load automations. If you're interested in learning more about ETLs and this idea of maintaining one schema but putting out multiple outputs, I'll be conducting another webinar for the ERISA NG911 task force on June 22nd, and I recommend that you sign up and attend that as well, along with Matt Garricky from Virginia. He's going to show us some examples, and I'm going to talk about these concepts there. You also have to think about, as the consummate GIS professional, impacts to ancillary PSAP or ECC systems. I'm going to need probably a different parsing and a different schema for my CAD system. I'm going to need that for something even different still for an AVL or a situational awareness application, perhaps. This schema or deliverable variation can even be an issue inside the PSAP. But if you want to use that same GIS data set for applications outside the PSAP, it'll be especially effective. The next thing to think about is community attributes, because community is a complicated discussion, can be a complicated discussion in 911, especially at the intersection of next generation 911 GIS data transition, because there's community that's viewed in the MSAG kind of on an island, then there's postal communities to consider, and then there's the next generation 911 community. So I want to go through real quick here and kind of elucidate what each one of those are, what they mean, when you're going to use them, and how during transition you're going to maintain the GIS data about them. So the purpose of community in E911 starts with the MSAG community. What's important to note about the MSAG community is that has been managed historically by public safety for public safety purposes without any kind of visual reference or tie to the actual real world locations. In other words, the MSAG coordinator could make community whatever they wanted. It didn't have to be tied to postal. It didn't have to be tied to political boundaries. It didn't have to be tied to anything other than how do we route this call to the correct PSAP. And often the source or definition of these were not well documented. In other words, the MSAG coordinator at the time, say in the 1980s when it was stood up perhaps, felt like you should always go based on what the locals think their community is. Well, where does Ramona as a community stop and unincorporated San Diego County start? That's up to the MSAG coordinator, because there was no tie to an actual boundary of the community of Ramona, if one even existed. And then as time went on, maybe somebody in the 90s thought, well, I don't like that. I'd rather tie them to postal communities, because at least then I have some reference to the real world. And so they changed how those communities were managed, perhaps. But then at some other point, somebody decided that they really wanted the ESNs to reflect a real granular version of where the unique combination of law, fire, and EMS were actually unique and there were no duplicates. And so they might have changed the community at that point as well. All along these stops, they probably didn't do you the favor of thinking about the future use of the data and make good documentation. What that means is you may or may not be able to figure out why they did what they did in the MSAG community, but as the GIS professional, what you need to understand is, as long as you document that in the MSAG community field of the GIS data, exactly as it's documented in today's MSAG, that's what you need to know about it. Postal communities are interesting, but not that highly related to public safety. There is a perception out there that postal communities, and I say that as kind of a general statement, it may be true in some places that postal communities, that there is a relationship between postal communities and your MSAG or public safety communities, but by and large, and without, I feel comfortable making the general statement that there really isn't a connection between postal communities and public safety or MSAG communities necessary. These are driven by the zip codes. And the important thing to note about zip codes is that zip codes are entirely up to the discretion of the local postmaster. If if Shelly here, who's on our screen, goes on vacation one day, your zip code may actually change that day or that week that she's on vacation to Bob's zip code route number. And so that's why the USPS doesn't actually put out authoritative zip code boundaries. Now, there are companies out there that have taken the USPS data and made interpretation of what those boundaries are, but the USPS does not put out zip code boundaries because they are subject to constant change. And so it's important to note about postal community is that if there's a relationship between your MSAC community and your postal community, then it should be observed. But if there's not, then you shouldn't work too hard to make sure that the postal community is observed or impacts your GIS data. The emergency service number relates to the emergency service zone. It's driven by the unique combination of PSAP, law, fire, and EMS response. If it resembles political boundaries like city boundaries or special district boundaries, that's purely coincidental because the only thing it relates to or has to do with is the unique combination of PSAP, law, fire, and EMS responders in a given area. Incorporated municipality is the easy one, right? Because those are well documented in records and recorded documents. And so you can always tie back to what your incorporated municipality boundary should be. And then there's the unincorporated community. This is a next generation 911 data field that is optional in the data model, because if you're in an unincorporated area, not in a municipality, you wouldn't populate this unincorporated, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. If you are in a municipality, you would not populate the unincorporated community attribute because you're inside of a municipality. If you're outside of a municipality, your unincorporated community is probably the best place to populate what you might think of as community where there is no municipality. This is an example. I use the example of Ramona in San Diego County. It happens that the general plan of San Diego County defines these unincorporated community areas, and so they have a boundary for it. That makes life easier for the GIS professional, but in many places these don't exist. And so you have to do some research when you're populating an unincorporated community, and at some point somebody simply has to make a decision, a judgment call about where Ramona ends and North Mountain in this particular case might begin. Then there's the neighborhood community. This is a new element that recognizes the fact that in some places, particularly in urban, highly populated areas, that there are super neighborhoods, there are other neighborhoods. The best example I like on this list, and this list comes right out of the Civic Location Data Exchange format document, is the one in New York City, where it points out as a use case example of how to populate these fields. The county would be New York County, the unincorporated community would be New York, and then the maybe the municipality would be New York. The neighborhood would be Harlem and West Harlem. And I'm not telling you the right thing here, but I've highlighted this one, so it must be the neighborhood community. The neighborhood would be West Harlem. Forgive me, I didn't put the column headings here, and that's what's throwing me off. So this is an optional element in the GIS data, but if you're the GIS professional responsible for a jurisdiction that has lots of communities, lots of population, you could use things like subdivision names or just areas of town if you wanted to maintain that. If it's going to be helpful and bears a relationship to a boundary that's important, this is a field that you can use in Next Generation 911. I talked about Pitiflow, and I'm not going to get too deep into Pitiflow at all. In fact, if you've attended our monthly webinars, you've seen this a time or two. But all of that to say that this is the little piece of data, the presence information, document data format, location object is the piece of data that's going to send your device location along with the 911 call. If it's sending a civic address, it's going to use this format: country, A1, A3, road, street suffix, house number, a building name, postal code, and this is a room name in this example. It's important to note that A3 is the incorporated municipality, airport is the street name, the street suffix or post type, the house number, and there is a hierarchy, and that's really the only thing that I want you to take away from using the Pitiflow here, is that there is a community or a location hierarchy that connects the FGDC standard, which GIS folks may know and understand, probably not, but maybe, the Federal Geographic Data Committee, by the way, addressing standard, to the NG911 CLDXF and GIS data model standard, and then how it's referred to in the PITIF is in the parentheses here. But that hierarchy starts at a country name, moves to state name, and then to the county, the incorporated municipality, the unincorporated community, the neighborhood community, then to the postal community and postal code. Somebody asked a question: Pitiflow looks like XML notation. That is absolutely correct. That XML gets put into that format, and that little packet of data hops along the IP hops that help answer the question, where do I send the call? And then it goes into the dispatch center. Once it gets to that PSAP, that same Pitiflow packet of data will go to populate CAD systems and other systems with location. Good, you've made a good assumption in that case. So why is this important, this community stuff? This zone attribute, if you think about the way that a geolocator works, which is at the core of the ECRF, the emergency call routing function, which answers the question, where do I send this 911 call? The zone attribute, or the combination of these zones together, will impact how the geocoder places that point for the point and polygon query that occurs in the ECRF. It's also important to understand about these communities and these sustainable workflows we talked about up front, and how the schema, the next generation 911 GIS data model, is intended to work, is that these proper connection of legacy data to next generation 911 GIS data is necessary in a fully functional next generation 911 system during this transition period. And the spatial representation of community boundaries will help you in that research and will help to solve the puzzle as you get your address points, your site structure address points, or SSAP, and road center lines properly attributed with correct geometry, placement, and the correct attributes. Next-gen core service providers, which are those functional elements inside the ESINet, the Emergency Service IP network, that are required, that do the answering of the questions and move the data along and actually route the 911 call, they have unique requirements that impact how some of these attributes should be determined. When you see the final version of version 1 of the GIS data transition document that NINA working group that I'm a part of is working on, you'll see some guidance as to the types of things you should be asking your next-gen core service provider about in terms of how their functional elements and their software deals with your GIS data, because there are things that couldn't be contained in a standard, but yet are relevant to how you prepare your GIS data. That's why community is important, and that's why all of the parsing and schema parsing and schema discussions that we had earlier in the webinar here today are critical to how you prepare your GIS data, to how you maintain your GIS data, and especially during this dual maintenance phase of the transition. So I want to move into next, how does Datamark help our clients overcome the challenges that we've been talking about? Well, we have a little saying at Datamark here that our purpose in life is to educate, advocate, and problem solve with our clients. We want to make sure through things like our monthly webinar series here that everybody knows and understands what are the important things about next generation 911 GIS that I, as a GIS professional in today's case, but also as a 911 professional in some of our other webinars cases, know what I need to know to succeed. Then as we figure out problems and we begin to think about solutions that we can help you as the client advocate for the solution that you need, we can help you find that solution in the problem solving stage as well. If there's a problem, if there's a question, we want to be your go-to source for GIS expertise for next generation 911 GIS and any other public safety GIS need. So we have a few offerings on hand that I want to make sure everybody is aware of that help specifically with the things we've talked about today. First of all, a GIS strategic plan. A goal without a plan is just a wish. These things that we've really talked about today are the types of things that really need to be dug into prior to just jumping into editing your GIS data. There are things like, what are the data workflows? What are the hardware software workflows? What are the business architecture workflows that need to be designed? And what would be an optimal process and procedure during transition and an optimal process and procedure in an end state that will help you build and maintain the right GIS data set for your next generation 911 systems, as well as public safety, other systems, as well as that don't break the enterprise integrations that you have already in your data. We also offer a service called the Address Comparison and Evaluation Service, which can answer the question, what addresses do I not have in my data set now? And what community are they in? What holes in my attributes can be filled in, even in place where I have geometry, but I don't have the right attributes, can be found in other GIS and non-GIS data sets, such as recorder data sets, voting roles, things like utility databases. All those data sets can be compared and evaluated to help you populate the attributes you're missing or create the address points that you don't have. Then ultimately, this effort of getting over the hump of remediating your data can be a long haul, and not every GIS organization out there has enough resources in the proper expertise to be able to do it all by themselves. We want to be your go-to source of expertise for advice on how to remediate. We want to be your go-to source for resources in terms of you need a few GIS technicians to do some very specific tasks. We can help you with that. And then ultimately our software, which if you're a regular at our monthly webinars here, you've seen demos of, Datamark VEP, will help you validate, edit, and provision GIS data during the transition period and beyond. It will help you establish data quality standards and QC checks. It will help you with non-GIS editors through the editing interface, through a web browser that you don't have to go buy GIS software for. And it will help you with that ETL automation that we talked about earlier. Maintain one database, but export or ETL multiple deliverables into multiple schemas out of that same database. Datamark VEP can help with that. So I really appreciate everybody's time today. If there's any questions, I'll take them now. I see that there is a comment or two here. Does anyone know if NOAA has polygons for community? I know during severe weather, the meteorologists often mention communities. That's a good question. I never had that one before. Looks like Brian helped you find some community shape files. Well, that's awesome. I'm going to take that one back myself. Thank you, Brian. Grant asked about the slide deck. I'm not sure if we're sending those out or not, but I know that we do share recordings of the sessions. You should receive an email, I believe, from the same address you registered with a recording of the session. And Carrie has a question that I don't understand. So Carrie, if you want to elaborate on that, what is it? ESZY-net? Oh, ESZY-net. Thank you. Sorry. I hate it when people use acronyms because they use them so fluently that they forget to tell you what they are, and I apologize for doing that to you. And ESZY-net is an emergency services IP network that is the network backbone for Next Generation 911. So all the software functional elements, like the emergency call routing function, like the location validation function, and many others that aren't spatial or GIS data consuming, reside inside that network, that private secure network that's only for Next Generation 911. That's what an ESZY-net is. If that helps. Any other questions we can answer? If not, I certainly do appreciate everybody's time and attention today. And if you have any questions that I haven't been able to answer for you, here's my contact information, my email, my phone number. I welcome any and all inquiries in whatever format you want to make them, so that we can help educate everyone, advocate, and problem solve. So thank you for attending today. We're going to close it up here, and everybody have a great week. We'll look forward to seeing you at the next installment of the monthly webinar.